So far, we've covered the loans the US extended to Europe so it could keep purchasing arms during World War I. The fighting ended in November 1918, but the loans didn't. The US continued right on with lending money to Europe. But why? Part of the reason has to do with pork. Once the armistice had been signed, US officials couldn't wait to swoop in with relief and reconstruction loans to Europe so it could start patching itself back together after war on a scale the world had never before seen. But there was one problem. Congress wasn't on board. It refused to allocate funds to lend to Europe. What this meant was that the threat of an agricultural and industrial price collapse was rapidly catching up with the US. Here's why. Europe had been buying food from the United States. However, after World War I, Europe was economically devastated. Food prices had been inflated during the war, and they had reached the point that Europe just couldn't afford to buy American-produced food anymore. In January 1919, Britain canceled its monthly food orders. In response, fear shockwaved through US farming interests that they were on the brink of a price collapse. The US government had already been scrapping thousands of automobiles and motor trucks to keep the automobile industry afloat, and it was starting to look like agricultural products were about to go the same way. The situation was so dire that Herbert Hoover, then head of the US Food Administration, contacted President Wilson. In a letter, Hoover wrote that US manufacturers' stockpiles were practically bursting. Usually, these goods would be shipped to Europe, except Europe didn't have the money to buy them anymore. For most products, that was fine. As long as they weren't perishable, they could continue sitting in a warehouse. But pork was perishable, and there was just too much of it for the United States to consume. Shipments of pork were building up, and if they weren't exported soon, they would go bad. The reason this was a problem was because banks had loaned something on the order of several $100 million to the pork production industry. If all that pork went bad, banks wouldn't be able to collect on the money owed to them. The fallout wouldn't be limited to just the pork sector. It would hit the entire American market. The US was teetering over the abyss of a full-blown financial crisis. And, Hoover added, a betrayal of the American farmer. To find out what the US did to avoid what looked like an incoming financial crisis, stay tuned for Part 10.